Welcome to our Inequality podcast. My name is Gabi Spilker. I'm the co-speaker of the cluster of excellence, the politics of inequality, and a professor of international politics, global inequality. And with me is
Marius Busemeyer. I'm professor of comparative political economy and speaker of the excellence cluster politics of inequality. Welcome to our new episode.
And our new episode of the Inequality podcast will today deal with one of our so-called 3 Ps. What are our so-called 3 Ps? Our cluster, the politics of inequality, is based on a common framework. And this framework, which we call the 3 Ps cycle, is based on the idea that to understand the politics of inequality, it is important to first understand how people perceive inequality. Then, based on these perceptions, the next step of this cycle is how perceptions influence political participation, and then how participation affects policies that then can influence full circle back inequalities. And today we would like to focus on the first P, namely on perceptions. And therefore we have invited a very distinguished guest who, as a psychologist, is indeed an expert on how people perceive inequality. So welcome, Juan Diego.
Yeah, thank you.
So Juan Diego García-Castro is a professor of social psychology at the Universidad de Costa Rica. He received his PhD from Granada University in 2020, where he focused on the psychosocial effects of perceived economic inequality in everyday life. He subsequently worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the Centro de Estudio de Conflicto y Cohesión Social, COES, in Chile, where he is also today an associate researcher. His main research areas also include injustice evaluations, social comparisons, ideology, and violence in Latin America. He is currently our guest at the cluster of the politics of inequality, at least for another 2 weeks, and therefore it's high time that we do this podcast. So welcome again. And maybe we just start with a very general, potentially simple, but maybe not so simple question. What are inequality perceptions? What do researchers really mean when they use this term?
Okay, perfect. Well, perception is a basic cognitive process through which people capture information from the environment. Any kind of information could be about inequality, but also could be about what people see in their everyday life. In the particular case of inequality, it is the process through which people perceive the inequality around them. And here we have to make several claims to differentiate this psychological construct. First, as a basic cognition process, people can easily perceive inequality with their close friends or family, places that people usually go. However, as humans, of course, we cannot perceive inequality beyond our daily life. And we think like this is important because research has shown us how difficult it is to understand inequality measures, like, for example, the most famous one, the Gini coefficient, or also difficult to understand or to know how much money do the rich people have. But people can understand, also we can understand if a friend of ours have problems paying their rent or if they have problems to make it into the end of the month. So we have to be clear, like it is easier for people to understand what they can see, but it is more difficult to understand or things like it's beyond their daily life.
That's very interesting. I mean, so you think that inequality is maybe different from other social phenomena in that respect, that it's very abstract? I mean, if you think about economic growth or even the welfare state, right? I mean, there's a very abstract level, whatever the welfare state does in terms of redistribution. And there's the everyday experience of people. You see your neighbor, you see your friend. Is he or she poor? Is he or she rich? Does she get money from the state and so on? How do you connect these everyday experiences with these abstract or perceptions of abstract things like inequality and the welfare state?
Actually, what research has shown is like people have problems to understand this comparison process between wealthy people or people with a lot of money and people who don't have that much money. And people have problems to understand abstract concepts that are far away from their life. What we actually try to do is focus on what people actually can do or can process in their minds. Like, for example, their friends, their family. And that's something that is have more influence on how people react against inequality or to inequality then yeah, the comparison between 20% of the population with more money and 80%, that have like less money. So people don't usually in daily basis, people are not making abstract observation or abstract processes, but they can see what happened in their neighborhood or in the school that their kids go to. So people can perceive that more easily than abstract concepts like welfare states.
Does that also mean, Juan Diego, that people who live in more diverse neighborhoods where they are exposed to more rich people but also more poor people have potentially a different understanding of inequality than people who live in very homogeneous or similar neighborhoods who don't experience the breadth, so to say, of society?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. But the problem is like in their neighborhoods, people live with more people that are similar to them, and their friends are more similar to them, like the same social class, the same amount of resources. So we don't find like really diverse neighborhoods like they should be. And this is important because when people cannot see the difficulties of other people, this makes people have some belief about inequality that tend to justify it. For example, the meritocracy ideology, because people cannot compare in a neighborhood, like people are all the same, or if their friends are from the same social background, people cannot make this comparison. And yeah, that's a shame because that's one of the reasons people justify inequality.
Isn't that maybe also a problem for, we want to speak more in normative terms, for the politics of inequality? Because as you say, poor people are associated with relatively poor people, and so they don't perceive themselves necessarily as very poor. I mean, that's also what we find in our inequality barometer. And the rich people think, well, everybody has money, so why should we do redistribution? They have rich friends as well, right? And also with regard to wealth inequality, I think this is also something that we found in our research, that because it's so abstract and some people's wealth is just so much beyond the experience of everyday life, like somebody like Elon Musk, or, right, I mean, having billions of dollars, that's so much beyond what people perceive that they don't actually have meaningful preferences potentially about what to do about this kind of wealth. They don't perceive the actual extent of inequality potentially. They underestimate the extent of inequality if they only look at their immediate neighborhood. Isn't that a problem potentially for, the politics of inequality?
It is a problem because, as you said, people don't actually estimate the real level of inequality that we're living now. But that's like our job as academians, that to show people what the actual inequality is. And actually, when we make some experiments and we ask people, how much inequality do you think you have in your country or in the town that you live? And when we make them, give them the information, the real information, we can change their perception and also their willingness to do some redistribution of wealth. So that's a problem, but that's our job, to show people how much inequality we are living at the moment.
Speaking of your job, maybe it would be a good point to tell to our listeners what really affects these inequality perceptions. We now know that it's difficult for people to have a realistic perception of how big inequality really is. But what do we know about these inequality perceptions? How do people form their minds? What affects these inequality perceptions? What does the research tell us?
Well, perception is, as I said, as a psychological processes in people's mind. And we know like socialization, like the process humans learn to come into culture, is important. For example, we learn from our parents core values that become attitudes and also perceptions. And what this research line has shown us is that ideology and context, for example, play a key role in forming an attitude and also a perception. And here we have to take a closer look at the role of ideology, because we know that it has an important impact people's perception. For example, people from the left spectrum perceive more inequality than people from the right. But also people who justify inequality also shape their attitudes and perceptions based on their ideology. And we learn ideology in everyday life from TV, schools, work, and talking to other people. So we have a big role in how people perceive reality, and in this case, inequality.
Maybe we could go a bit more deeper here. What do you mean when you talk about ideology?
Well, basically, in the psychological science, ideology is like the ideas that people have about anything that happens in their life. For example, about elections or really basic stuff like why people react to social problems in one way or another way. And we all need to make some ideas and attribution of why this is happening. And so that's ideology, the idea that people have around one social problem or social aspect of reality. In the case of inequality, people make attribution of why some people have more money than other ones and why this happening, if they deserve it or not. In the case of inequality, we have at least two main ideas that we already talked a little bit about. The first one is meritocracy, the idea that people deserve their place in society because of their merit, or if they're smart, or because they deserve it, or also the opposite idea that poor people deserve to have that place in society because they don't work enough or they're lazy and so on. And the other ideology that plays an important role here is system justification. That's the idea that the system in which we live, the society system, the capitalist society, has to be justified because that's the natural order of things. But that's an idea. Different people have different ideas, but those two are the main ones that now we are studying in relationship with inequality.
Is it also related to this theory of the just world beliefs? Because that's something that I learned also in the context of our research here in the cluster as a quite important psychological theory. And I find it quite fascinating. So there's evidence that people who think that we live in a just world are in many regards actually doing better. They have a better health outcomes, mental health especially, but also they kind of believe in meritocracy, as to say, even though nobody knows whether it's actually true. And of course, there are some evidence that our societies are not entirely meritocratic, to put it mildly, right? So, but apparently people who think that this is all fair to some extent, they're actually doing better. Is that related to this inequality perceptions as well? Is that part of the story, or is it something?
No, it is actually it's part of the story. Like as humans, we need to have some sense of controls in our life. We know, like, if we come to work, at the end of the month, we're gonna get paid. We know, like, we try to eat healthy, we're gonna have better health. So we need to feel some sense of control. When you see a society that is not fair, or society that has some extreme level of inequality, people have to make an explanation of what is happening. But it also happens not only with inequality, with other social issues, with crime, or people who have cancer, for example, or diseases. People make an explanation and attributions of why this is happening. In the case of inequality, they also do that, right? And when you make an explanation, like they say, okay, this is the natural way of how society should be, or people deserve to be in that situation. So it's more easy to live, right? More like you have like more control about why this is happening. And that's why people have better outcomes in their perception of their life than just believe like this is not fair. So we live in a society that's not fair. And that's a threat for mental health for people. So it's more easier for people to justify inequality. But we know, like, when people do that, that's kind of like a circle of producing more inequality. So people justify more inequality, so we don't react against inequality, we don't support policies of redistribution, so we have more inequality, people perceive more inequality, justify more inequality, and then we are trying to, in our research, we're trying to break this cycle of reproduction of inequality, but we're trying to do it, we are doing more or less.
That's highly interesting. So in essence, what you're suggesting is that people really need to perceive inequality as unfair and not as fair as is often done. And so my question would be, how does that happen? What could lead to people perceiving inequality as wrong or as not meritocratic? What would trigger people to come to this conclusion?
Yeah, well, we have to differentiate between perceptions and attitudes, or perceptions and evaluations, because first, people perceive. As a second step process and cognition, people evaluate. So we all live in the same place, let's say, and we see something similar. But then we have to evaluate how those things are, right? And when people do that in their minds, or in our minds, we have different variables or different aspects that have an influence in how people evaluate, in this case, inequality as unfair or fair or very unfair, or whatever measure that we use. And we know, like, as we talk about ideology, but we also know that context and culture plays a role in how people evaluate inequality as unfair or not. And here, for example, we know that people with more education have more resources in their minds and also material resources to see the spectrum of inequality better than people with less education or less resources or income. And this is puzzling because we will believe like people in the bottom of the social hierarchy will understand better how inequality works, but actually we know that we have the opposite result. People with more education have a better perception, a better idea of what is happening in society. But also culture plays a role here.
But before we go to culture, can I ask a follow-up question on the latter one? That, to me, suggests that those who might be on the profiting side of or the beneficial side of inequality, those with typically higher educational outcomes that typically earn more money and so on, they are the ones who potentially better understand how big inequality is and that it might be a problem, but it's not the ones necessarily that materially lose out from the inequality. So is that not a dilemma in some sense? Don't we need those who profit to kind of support those who lose out, but who might not have the time, the resources to really understand and act upon that?
No, it is a big dilemma. Of course, it is. We were talking before. This is happening because people with more education or more income have more diverse social networks. They hang around, let's say, with people with money, but also, they can have people working for them or their companies or different people, so they can estimate better the inequality. But people with lower incomes have more problems to know different people from upper, higher social classes. So they have more problems to estimate the inequality because they don't actually see it. One of our research line is try to make people aware of this inequality, also try to break the cycle of justifying it. So what we're trying to do as a researchers on inequality is finding the mechanisms in which people can perceive the amount of inequality we are actually living. But it's a dilemma, and we're trying to make our contribution with the work that we do.
That's very interesting. Maybe talking now more about culture and context. I mean, you come from Costa Rica and you work at COES in Chile, and now you're in Europe. So you have this comparative experience of being exposed to different contexts. And me as a comparative researcher, I'm always interested in the impact of different societal contexts on preferences, perceptions. What would you say? I mean, how much does context really matter relative to all these individual factors? And if context matters, how do people in Latin America think differently about this than people in Europe?
Yeah, well, first, we have some very interesting results about this because, for example, we know that cultures that are more open to knowing more people, for example, the Hispanic cultures, perceive more inequality than those with closer social circles. Like, for example, we have data from Japan. So when people are more willing to know more people, and so they have more diverse social networks, so their social sampling is more diverse, they actually perceive more inequality than people who are in cultures that are more close or like more focused on their families. So we have this really cool result about that. We are like, this called like social relational mobility. We are also studying that, but Latin America is a particular case. We believe that, I think we have some results that support our claims. And actually we think it's important, Latin America is an important place to study the interplay between objective inequality and subjective inequality. And we have basically two ideas of why we think so. First, Latin America suffers extreme levels of economic inequality, and around 80% of the population evaluated as unfair or very unfair. And this makes people constantly fight against inequality. For example, if you, at any time in history, but let's say nowadays, you take a closer look of what is happening, you can find big social mobilizations in some countries in Latin America that are trying to change our societies. But we also suffer from a really heavily repression from our elites that try to maintain the unequal society that benefits them. So first, we have extreme levels of inequality, but also we have people who is constantly fighting against inequality into trying to change our societies. And then we have also an interesting result from cultural psychology that show us that we live in communal societies in Latin America, but also, let's say, some Confucian societies in Asia are also communal.
What do you mean by communal? So very close.
Societies make an important focusing on the group than the individual.
Okay. Compared to individualist culture.
What would be an example for an individualist culture? Just borrow.
Yeah, we can say Germany, for example.
Okay,
That can be focusing more on the individual. But this is not to say that this is wrong or bad. We are not talking about narcissistic or selfish. It's not. It's a culture that values the individual. It seems like really important than the group. In communal societies, value like the group, like they say, over the individual. So it's not like something to be good or bad. It's just how different societies work. And what is triggering for us is like we have communal values in our societies in Latin America, but our ego identity, like how people perceive themselves, is very individualistic. And it doesn't make sense with theory, right? Because we have like communal societies, for example, in Asia, where they have an independent, like an interdependent ego identity. That will say like the way they see themselves are more focused on the relationship with others. And we have some results, for example, here in Germany, that culture that focus more on the individual have a more individualistic ego identity. So that makes some sense in research. But we have communal values in Latin America, but even a more individualistic identity than, for example, in Germany. And that doesn't make sense. We will think like, why this is happening? Why this is particular in the case of Latin America? In our hypothesis, is that it has to be with the extreme level of inequality that we live in our countries, because in order to survive, and when we compare, we have like an elite that have a lot of money and wealth and people trying to survive in their daily life. So people has to develop an identity that can like try to survive in this really unequal environment. So we have this like result that's particular in the case of Latin America that reflects how inequality shapes people's behavior. And we think that these two basic ideas, extreme labels of inequality, extreme mobilization against inequality, and also how inequality shapes our identity, are really particular in the case of Latin America. And that's why we think that researchers on inequality should take a closer look of what is happening over there.
That's very interesting. Maybe just one brief follow-up question on this. And I know this is going a little bit beyond your expertise as a psychologist, but if there are, as you say, majorities in the population that think inequality is high and unfair, if there's lots of mobilization against inequality, and at least in the democratic countries of Latin America, why is it still so persistent? I mean, I'm thinking about Chile especially. Why is there no candidate that runs on a generous welfare state or something like that? Why is it so persistent still?
Yeah, our claim is because the elites have no willing to change.
So the response is a problem of responsiveness.
Yeah, I mean, it's like
Even in
when we see in the, let's say in the last 20 or 30 years, when some countries in Latin America have some progressive governments to do some redistribution or reducing of poverty, our economic indicators went better with time. But they don't solve it, like they can reduce some part of inequality or reduce some poverty, but they don't solve it. And then people go again with the populist candidates that gets the numbers backwards, or like inequality also increase. So my hypothesis about why cannot change inequality is because our elites play an important role to trying to maintain the system, and we have a lot of repression. We have a lot of people in jail, people who social activists that get like in the judicial system with charges and some other bad stuff that's happening that makes inequality continue, but it is unmoving, it is ongoing. We don't know what is going to happen in the future. And we believe like the research that we do on inequality can play a role in trying to change that's in the inequality. Like we do, of course, basic research, but we also, at the end, what we're trying to do is finding like the best policies to reduce inequality, not also in Latin America, but that's what we do here also in the cluster in Germany, in Europe, and so on.
Of course, here I have one more question that also relates to how you started your answer, and that was that people also care about poverty. And this is something that always keeps me thinking, is it inequality that people care more about? That's relational. How much do I earn in relation to you or someone else? Or is it really poverty? Are parts of the population simply too poor? And of course, the two are related, but they're not the same. And what would you say? Is it that people care more about poverty or more about inequality? Do the two things go together? What is your stance?
Well, it's a tricky question. I think, we know that it is easier for people to care about poverty than inequality, because inequality is more complex to understand. Poverty, let's say, is just one group of people that can arouse sympathy, but inequality involves a social comparison between the have and the have-nots, which is more difficult to process in cognition. However, we know based on data that the wealth from one group comes from the poverty of others, and this is why as scientists we care about inequality, and it's also, as I said before, our job to explain to society our results and inequality. But we believe, like, in the end, when people care about poverty, they care also about inequality, even though they cannot be conscious of it.
And maybe just the last question from my side, if you're looking forward, what are the big research questions that should be addressed in the coming years?
Yeah, well,
maybe in the coming 2 weeks anyway, here in the class.
Another tricky question. I think we know inequality is bad, but we don't know exactly how to mobilize people to change it. And we need to understand better the mechanism that drives people to have more egalitarian attitudes and how to combine as we talk, the widespread ideology that justifies them, for example, meritocracy or system justification. And what we actually are trying to do is to understand this process better, to give society a better answer of how we can live in more equal societies. Of course, I cannot come to this podcast and not say that from our perspective, we also have to include the global south within the current scientific research to at least know if the results that research and inequality is finding are basic process of human behavior or specific to some societies that are more studied than others.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for this great discussion. I really learned a lot. And thanks, Gabi, for being part of this again. Thanks for the video.
As always.
And if you like this podcast, sign up to our channel. We have a new episode coming out every first Wednesday of the month. And we're looking forward to seeing you soon here again. Thank you.